Thomas här? Ja, Thomas. Så här är det. Jag tar den här delen på svenska för er som är här. Men sen så slår vi om till engelska. Dels för att vi har engelsktalande panelmedlem. Men också för att det är flera stycken som sitter och tittar i Bryssel. Men det här är då ett Ralf Dahrendorf Roundtable. Så vi skickar runt papper som ni kan bara signera ert namn och nationalitet. För det här kommer sen, det betyder att vi får lite pengar från Europaparlamentet. Så då måste vi bevisa att folk har varit här. Så att ni vet. Så Thomas kommer runt med papper, så vi skulle uppskatta om ni bara fyllde i det och skickade runt. Okay, let's start then. Welcome to Fores, the Green and Liberal think tank. And this event is also a cooperation with the European Liberal Forum, ELF, which runs a Ralph Dahrendorf Roundtable series. So this seminar is part of that series. We're excited to launch this book today. Because from a liberal perspective, flying is quite a dichotomy with various angles to it. And instead of getting stuck in the flying debate today, should we not, how much emissions, how little emissions, etc., etc., this study actually focuses on what we can learn from those who stop flying in a constructive and really positive way. And that is something that we as a liberal organisation and green organisation would like to highlight and see what we can learn from this new trend of staycations and various angles from the policy perspective. So our two authors, Maria Wollrath Söderraff and Nina Worms, will introduce the study and explain what they have looked into for all of you. And then Hannah will come on and give us her view from a Finnish perspective. In a way, she's a prize Finnish journalist. But we'll start with Maria and Nina. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Mette. My name is Nina Worms.
And I'm Maria Wollrath.
This study, the research is done within the realm of a research project that was funded by Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, a Swedish foundation for research in the humanities and social sciences. And that deals with the non-action in climate, in the climate realm. But when we were studying why people didn't act, even though they had the knowledge and the will, we realized very soon that one of the occasions where people were sort of caught in cognitive dissonance, you know, when you want to do something and you end up doing another thing, you don't feel very well. We call that cognitive dissonance. And a very common occasion for people was when they were flying. So we took the opportunity of having this ongoing project and the flying debate, and we made a large survey asking people who'd stopped flying for climate reasons how they'd reasoned with themselves, what their arguments were, and how what their thinking looked like.
And then we had very many answers in a very short time. About 24 hours, I think we had 800 answers or something. And they were elaborate and very articulated. And very open. People even told us about quite personal dimensions. And we looked at the argumentative structures. I'm a rhetorician and Nina is a
historian of technology.
Yeah. And used to try to understand how people reason when it comes to knowledge and learning. And we found that, and we were surprised actually, because it wasn't what we had exactly what we had expected. Because from the discussions, one could believe that shame would stand out as a major impact factor. But shame was, it is there somewhere. It has had some kind of impact, but it was not what people lifted up. What they lifted up was instead a combination of factors, and the most important one was knowledge. And it wasn't any knowledge, it was two types of knowledge. One of the types were a knowledge about the severeness, the acuteness, the urgency of climate actions and the climate problems. And this knowledge had accumulated over time for many, and become an insight or a driving force when and often very emotional when they either had experienced something like the heat the last not this summer but the summer before, or when they had met somebody who had changed their mind, or when their children had expressed their view on it. And the other form of knowledge was about proportions. They had realized the size of the emissions from flying, either the size of the Swedes' emissions from flying or the size of their own emissions compared to other things that they do. Mm.
So the first group of thoughts or thought structures or arguments we could say belong to knowledge, and a knowledge that is all very often connected to experience and emotions, strong emotions. The second that we've grouped is that it's actually, and this is where shame sort of enters in a bit, but here it's hard to say what people really mean. But one of the other large groups is that people view flying as a moral issue, which means that their conscience is engaged when they make decisions on flying. And this has to do with ideas of justice and equity and the distribution of resources. And it's very common, as Maria said, children could be the ones who engaged us emotionally, but they can also be the ones who we want to surrender the earth to, right? So there's an intragenerational moral argument of some of the people who stop flying. They realize that they want to stop because they want the earth to be there for future generations. But they also regard other people in other parts of the globe as having the right to the resources. So the conscience, the moral issue, is one of the more central thought structures that people refer to when they stop flying.
And it's interesting, I just want to add something on the moral dimension, that another thing that we saw was that it's kind of a discursive problem. People want their arguments to hang together. They want to have an inner logic between their knowing and their reasoning. Many of our informants said things like, I can't motivate it anymore. I can't legitimize it. I can't justify it. And many mention also some kind of identity dimension. They feel a crack in their identity when they don't live as they preach or walk the talk. Mm.
And so this identity is also sometimes a social issue. It is the one that you want to be in relation to others. So the third group of thought structures has to do with your surrounding. And this is not so surprising. We are social beings, right? Still, it's surprising that people seem to argue, they're arguing as though they were autonomous. But we can clearly see that they are influenced by and they're influencing others. So role models and the media debate and children again, or friends or family that have done something in this direction are influencing this group of people. And they also want to influence others. So that's also a reason to stop flying. I want to make a difference. I want to be a role model. Again, I want to be consistent with what I want to preach what I practice what I preach. And this group of argument has a clear social dimension. And it's also a place where people can, if you don't have the social group around you, like in a room, you could also go on social media and find people and learn from your social context. And actually, when we ask people what stopped them from not flying, the wrong social context sometimes stopped them because the flying norm is so strong. So then you could find another social context in which you can develop your arguments and then finally make the decision.
And it's interesting because it's not the social context is not described as a negative force like shame, that people are afraid of what others will think about them, but rather a positive force, that it makes possible new ways of choosing how to act. So that's interesting.
The fourth and final large group. So, of course, we can also, as you can see in the publication, we can divide these into subgroups. But if we want to make 4 big arguments, the fourth one is actually that there are alternatives, which is a policy easy way to go. So, taking the train or staying home or doing things that just replace the flying is an argument for stop flying, actually.
And now, what we have, of course, been thinking a lot about what are the implications of this for climate communication or for policy work and so on. And of course, it's limited what you could say from this study. I mean, it's not a representative group for all Swedes or all the world. It's a very specific group. It's people who have stopped flying. So we don't know what people who have not stopped flying are thinking, of course. But still, there are some ideas that we would like to look more into. And if we connect them to the different types of arguments, it's interesting that this knowledge about proportions is so important to these people. And that an implication of that would be that climate calculators or different kinds of markings that shows the impacts from different choices would be interesting to develop. Many of our informants say that this was a very shocking experience, doing a climate calculator or actually start counting on your own emissions.
It's interesting from a research perspective because we've been thinking that Swedes in general know, or people in general know that we have the knowledge and we just need to move to action now. But what our informants say is that they've reached another kind of knowledge, which means that we need to continue to teach and we need to continue to communicate. Another interesting result from our study that sort of not contradicts, but how do you say, challenges a bit an idea is that fear actually works. So to refrain from telling people about the urgency is not wrong. So there are assumptions that we shouldn't tell them the truth because it's so dire. But on the contrary, if people can act on the sense of urgency, then this is a really useful way of informing. But the crucial thing is that you are able to move or to make a decision or to engage yourself. So there are instances when fear doesn't work, but it's not clear that it doesn't work at all. Several of our informants clearly state that the sense of urgency, the scariness of this has made them act. And in psychology we know this, but in climate communication it's not been so clear actually.
And it's also interesting if we look at the other dimension, the one about the moral issues, we can see that there is some kind of moral negotiation going on within those people. And many of them have got their strategies for justifying just going on like usual. They have got those strategies debunked. They are not valid anymore. And so, for instance, when in our other bigger study, we have seen that the most common way of justifying going on as usual is some kind of account thinking. If you sort your waste, and if you go by cycle to work, or and so on, you have earned going on a Thailand vacation, and so on. But that way of thinking, for that way of thinking to be necessary, you can't. If you count more in detail, you find that you have to sort your waste for many decades to be able to go even on a very short trip. And there are lots of other very problematic thinking structures in that. For instance, that we could stay on the same level of emissions as we are now, and so on. So there are lots of problems. But those people in this study on flying, they have realized that you can't think that way. It's not a valid way of thinking. So that also, I think, gives some policy implications. It's necessary to discuss the ways we are thinking about this, and to actually debunk some of the argumentative structures that we use to save our conscience.
But on a final note, I think that we would like to say before we hand over to Hanna is that we also definitely think that those arguments and discussions that we think are necessary as a consequence of looking at these people who've made grounded decisions is that we, and this is also in relation to the shaming. So in general, shaming is not an emphatic way of convincing people. So we believe that much of the discussion that should come out of this should be a listening and sensitive discussion, because it's much more useful if you can take the perspective of the person that you're speaking to, rather than shaming the person that you want to convince. So that's a rhetoric.
Well,
you want to correct me on that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that it's because it might sound that shame is a bad thing in this debate, but I'm quite sure, and it seems that even if it's probably impossible to shame a climate skeptic, for instance, into behavioral change, there are actually several studies saying that that's not meaningful at all. But shaming might not work as we believe. Like if I shame you, you change behavior. It doesn't work that way. It works that if we are discussing the shame together in a group, if we have if we start talking about it, then we start orienting our ways of thinking in other ways, and we might even be more open to knowledge. So maybe shame has some kind of impact, but it's not as direct as we might think.
And not as direct as the media discussion is disclosed. That's probably the message. Well,
thank you. I'm going to bring up Hanna Nikkanen. You can stay. Okay. And then if Hanna and I go on this side. Yep, sure. And Hanna Nikkanen is a Finnish journalist who's done lots of things within the climate area, and you also been an editor for a prize book in Finnish about climate and how Finnish people kind of should have, what kind of relationship Finnish people should have with it. So that's why we invited Hanna to come along and give us your Finnish thoughts.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm actually living in Stockholm now, but I've been here totally kind of incognito, so I was surprised to get invited here. I'm studying at the Stockholm Resilience Center. But the topics of this report are something that I've been really thinking a lot about, and kind of hoping that someone would come up with this sort of a resource, this sort of like this sort of a study to kind of grasp these questions of the reasons for people's either action or non-action to the information that they have, because there's still so much that we have to learn about that, and we're kind of in a hurry to learn more about how that, like how those processes work. But yeah, so for background, so anyways, for congratulations on a fantastic report. For background, it's funny to come and offer a Finnish perspective to the climate conversation, because the way it works is actually that Sweden has a climate conversation, and then we kind of in Finland we just adopt that with a bit of a lag. So that's so you know, I might not have that much like completely new ideas, because we steal your ideas. It's really practical as a journalist to kind of go like, okay, so what's coming up, you know, in the next 6 months? You just check what people in Stockholm are talking about. But one thing that I wanted, like one anecdote that I wanted to share, comes from last month. In Finland, we have a thing called the citizen initiative. It's a direct democracy process where if you have a proposal for a legislative change and you manage to get 50,000 signatures from voting age people within 6 months, then that passes automatically to the parliament. And there was an initiative on the flight tax, and that the deadline, the 6-month deadline, came up last month. And I happened to be spending time with the people who had initiated that initiative. And like 2 days before the deadline, it was kind of somewhere at 15 to 17,000 signatures. Like it was hopeless. Like you need this much, and they were at this much. And that there had been 6 months of campaigning and all that. People were not signing, so it's kind of, they were pretty desperate, and it was kind of easy to draw the conclusion that this is just not something that people are willing to act on, even though polls would show that more than 50%, like a clear majority of Finns, are for the flight tax. But people are not against it. They were just not willing to sign a petition. So that was like a very easy, cynical conclusion to draw. And then suddenly something happened. And then during like the 2 days before the deadline, it suddenly started like picking up. And then it was suddenly exponential. And then it actually finished a day before the deadline. So it was just like it took 1 day or 1 day and a half to get the missing 70% of signatures. And that was fun to watch. And it's also like it kind of highlighted something that also your study highlights that you did not mention so much in your launch, but I think it's really important, which is a very old idea in communications theory, is this two-step flow. It's not enough to have just information, but people will react and turn that information into action when they have that, they need that second step of getting that information from someone in their immediate circle or someone that's influential and that they identify with. So it could be friends and family members. In this case, it's often like children to parents, but that's needed. Like no matter how much information you have and how sympathetic you are with an idea, but the action comes when you're not acting alone, when you feel like you're acting with your friends. So that definitely happened in that case. It was not a campaign thing. It was kind of more like well-put Facebook messages from the right kinds of people, not even necessarily like celebrities, or that happened as well, but more like people who had good social networks. And that was interesting. I thought it was really relieving to see that these old communications theories still work, that we're not like climate change communications is not a completely different kind of an animal to all kinds of other communications. Like we can understand the mechanisms. And it's kind of, and also just highlighting something I really want to believe in is that non-action is often just the phase before action. It's not that you look at a certain situation that's going on now and so like, okay, people are not doing anything. It must mean that they're incapable of action or that they're just not willing to act. We're kind of in the middle of a very young conversation. So we still like, there's still a lot of things that we haven't seen that are coming up. But anyways, so one thing that was kind of leading up to that and that's very much that Sweden and Finland have very much in common, was 2018. So we had the very long, hot summer that was for the first time was like really creating an economic crisis in agriculture. And you could see that that's also one thing that people are more likely to react to, something that they see as threatening to themselves. And that year also seemed to have like and things like climate calculators or like carbon footprint calculators were really influential in Finland as well. Public figures writing columns about their flight shame was really influential, kind of opening up a conversation that had not existed before. And then this change seemed to happen, like in the way people relate to, for example, negative feelings, talking about morals, talking about fear as well, which I feel like as long as I can remember, when we talk about climate, there's always been, like people have been very fast to say that negative feelings are counterproductive. Fear is counterproductive. You should not talk about moral because it will lead to shaming, and shaming is the worst that you can do. And that kind of, and I feel like the Fridays for Future movement has done also a lot to change kind of our relationship with those negative feelings, and it has become more like people are feeling that they can, you know, that negative feelings are really often pretty necessary in social change and in cultural shifts. People it's something that can push you to action. Obviously, people react really differently, and some people you can shame me. I react to shame, like my decisions to cut down on flying, maybe something like 8 years ago, that totally came from being directly shamed by a friend. So that works for some people, does not work for everyone, but we're kind of understanding that this is a more complex mechanism than just this thing, the idea that, you know, negative feelings are bad. We should always start on a positive note. So that's one thing that I feel that's been really interesting last year and this year. Another thing that is changing, I feel, in the conversation is kind of an erosion of the very strong dichotomy between individual choices and governance. Because again, that was something that was, as a journalist, very frustrating for a long time. When people ask, when people talk about climate, you're always fall into either camp. You're either talking about choosing the right toothbrush and an ecological soap, or you fall into the camp of going like it's only the structures. Let's stop talking about individual choices and let's only focus on governance and policies. And there was not much space. There was not like much of a conversation in between those. And now, in the past year or two, that space has opened up. That there are at least, I'm not like into talking about toothbrushes still, but talking about the big cultural shifts like food and travel that are directly affecting individual people and like that are affecting our consumption. That's, you know, it totally makes sense to talk about both, to talk about how we make our choices as individuals and how those choices are supported by and directed by governments. And so then that kind of takes us to a lot of the topics that you mentioned already in your talk about the people understanding the proportions of these couple of really important questions, the availability of alternatives, the social context, and information, both of which apparently you need to actually make like long-lasting changes in your lifestyle, and the importance of living according to your value system. That is also a political force. The fact that people should have, like for one, that they should have the opportunity to live according to their value system, that inner logic that you mentioned. But I wanted to kind of end with a question to you. How about in the responses, because you have seen hundreds of more than I have seen in the report, did people talk a lot about politics. Like I found it interesting. There's someone who said, for example, that well, even if we fail, like even if society fails, or even if we as mankind fail, I still don't want to be a part of the problem. Like so, that's one way to approach that. Is that individual choice is a way to react to the feeling that the system is not doing what it should, and that I have seen a lot in the flying conversation. But was there more of that?
It's a very good question, because in our other bigger, no, it's not bigger, but it's wider survey on people who on non-action. A very common way of reasoning is that it's no idea that I do anything because I'm so small, or it's the system's problem. It has to be done on a system level. It doesn't matter if I do anything, or even that if I solving a problem that is the system's problem would be in some way in conflict. But in this study, very few there are a few people mentioning the system, and they are saying that they want to be a force changing the systems. But often it seems to be assumed that there's no conflict, that I am a part of the system, and that the social doing your thing and talking about your friends about it is being part of a movement. And it harmonizes very well with research saying that big societal changes are made possible by movements, by individuals changing their behavior, but not in isolation, but in conversation. And that makes possible policy changes, business changes, and so on. And it's also how our democratic system is organized. People, if the politicians make major or very big changes, and the people are not with them, they won't. They will lose their power. So of course, it's a way of showing the system that if you go in this direction, we'll support you. So these people doesn't seem to make this dichotomy between individual and system that we can see in the other study.
But there are a few who say that the politicians don't do enough. So I need to take responsibility.
Yeah.
I need to act because this is too slow, and it's a moral issue. It's an obligation. So those kinds of answers are also there, which they don't say that it doesn't mean anything. On the contrary. People feel that they are important. And I think this is a very encouraging result. So I matter, and I can make a difference. Yeah,
it's hopeful. It's been very hopeful. It was very depressing looking at the other study. But are we mad? Are we totally crazy? We know all this. We don't act. We find all those. We're extremely skilled at finding arguments that it's not our responsibility. Somebody else has to act. But reading all those answers, it was so hopeful and inspiring, and it's really made me as a researcher. It was existential. It's made me rethink my life as a researcher, and it was very hopeful and inspiring. I hope it will inspire others.
The bigger survey that you did, because this survey is a group of self-selected people who are online. So already there's two special groups. So do you think you can see any relevance from your other bigger group and this group? Can the results from this small group be transferred to a bigger group who are offline?
So I think it's a very good question. I thank you for bringing that up, Mette. I think it's really important to understand that this is a qualitative study, and the study of the people who are flying is a totally different one from the other one that we're doing, which is actually a smaller sample. But we believe that the quality of these answers are also interesting. We can see what kind of arguments there are, but we can draw no general conclusions for the Swedish population as a whole. We need much more research to understand flying patterns and people's general reasoning around flying than the one that we've done. And we also need other kinds of methods and other kinds of disciplines if we want to have a fuller picture of this.
And quantitative studies probably as well.
Yes.
So a good start.
Yes.
But if we come back to the shame aspect, so if shame doesn't really work that well,
It
can
works in some way,
influence,
but
work. How can you deliver the knowledge that you talk about without fear and shame and?
Well, that's not our conclusion, that it should be done without. My personal preliminary idea about it is that it seems very necessary to discuss it from a moral angle.
But it's not what tips a person to
Well,
stop.
but also discuss, also bring up the knowledge that is necessary, but maybe not point fingers at people. But letting the moral issues become part of the debate, I'm quite sure it's necessary. And
think
also
it's-
fear.
I think it's a different thing to talk about a moral and a justice discussion and the shaming that we've discussed in social media. That is a much more reduced and clickbait kind of process. So having a moral discussion about resource scarcity on Earth is a very different thing from individual choice, right? Then people need to be able to translate, and in that translation, proportions and knowledge about the real emissions are important. But we're not saying we cannot see that that feelings are bad. We see that feelings are good. These are important issues to people. People have feelings.
Sounds good, since we're humans with feelings.
And one thing that I can see in the material, it's not very articulated, but there is somewhere behind. There are a lot of sorrow or mourning. Things have been lost and are going. Valuable dimensions of life are threatened, and people mourn. And it seems that mourning is also some. I'm not sure I have very substantial evidence to this, but it's more like a feeling that this mourning is also a power, something that is empowering and specifically we come together and talk about it, and maybe it's important to have spaces for that type of discussions.
I was even going to take a quote by Donna Haraway up here. Now I have it in my bag, so and I don't remember it exactly, but it was precisely about that. That mourning is also the process that is necessary when we redefine our relationships with as individuals and as societies and as communities, because that redefinition is needed. Like it's making a big cultural and social shift is not like you can't pretend that would be easy or fast.
No.
So that's kind of I feel that that's a big thing that comes up in these responses, is that people are going through different stages. They're renegotiating not just flying, but actually like a lot of relationships that they have with the world around them and things that they have grown up with, notions about consumerism, notions about what is good life, what is a holiday, what is what is relaxation, and what is their own moral responsibility to about like in relationship to with the environment. So kind of the idea that this renegotiation is hard work. It can be very giving. It can be like it can end in massive feelings of relief, but you can't skip it. You can't just jump, like have a magic bullet that makes you jump through over the difficult part and have the right new lifestyle and new relationships immediately. Like it is. So that was the Donna Haraway quote that I don't have with me here now. That I really like.
I think it comes up also in other kinds of contexts, and I think it's Ursula Heiser said that we've been mourning species lost for a long time, but this is a different kind of loss. It's a loss to come, or the loss that we choose because we see it's going to come. So that's a different kind of mourning process, and I totally agree that it's a constructive mourning process because it makes us realize what we do have and what we cannot have anymore. so that there's a scarcity here, and scarcity makes things become more valuable, right?
But it's interesting that this renegotiation that you're mentioning, we can see it clearly when people are telling about their process, and I really recognize their stories in myself. It's interesting because it was only actually a few years ago I realized when I started working with these issues that I can't fly anymore, and it was very threatening to my identity. Actually, it was a morning, and who am I? Am I not a globetrotter? It was I really it was something that it was really difficult to give it up at first. And it took a while, and then I just decided, and that's many mentions that then they just decided. And when they had decided, there was a short period of mourning, but after that they started looking for alternative ways of having vacation or transporting themselves or looking at themselves, and they found alternative ways. And it's interesting looking at how many lifts up the alternatives, specifically train journeys. And actually bring up dimensions of going by train as very important. The slowness, which usually is a problem, is here something valuable. The experience of seeing the landscape that you're going through, and being able to say no to the stress at airports and so on. So they're really negotiating ideas that have probably been important to them, and they are using these new coined terms, hemester or svemester, staycation, yeah, and some of them have decided to buy a little cottage. And someone is writing about having bought ducks because finding some kind of new meaning in their free time, and those ducks, the demands that they're there, they can't go away. It's very interesting with all this ingenuity in renegotiation. The renegotiation of practices,
and confirming your identity. It becomes like a reaffirming.
But it also feels like this is like those people are definitely like, even though it seems like it's a big movement now, but we're still talking about kind of the first wave, or maybe like the couple of first waves.
And it might die actually. We don't know what's going to happen. If it's
and a lot of the institutional actors have not really reacted. I did talk with a really interesting person from who's like promoting tourism in Finnish Lapland, saying that for one, it was probably a good thing that Thomas Cook went bankrupt, because they were the last travel agency that was organizing one-day trips from the UK to Lapland and back, which is like no good for anyone. Like not like that. Entrepreneurs in Lapland were not fans of that either, because that's like, how long do you get to with that group? But that they're still like, now they're kind of also renegotiating their reliance on Chinese tourism, and they still don't have a campaign in Sweden, for example. Like even though it would make sense for the Nordic countries that have a growing group of people like preferring to travel by land to do a lot more like promotion cross country. And that's still not happening. Like they're kind of aware that they probably should, but then they should probably also have better train connections available and kind of more infrastructure, and no one's quite moving to make that happen yet. So
many of our informants, they are astonished about their local possibilities. They say things like, I've been going abroad every summer since, but now I realize that in my own landscape there are so many nice attractions and so on. So that's also fascinating. I realized I have had the same process. I went to France every summer for 30 years, and have now been traveling around in Sweden instead, and it's really
discovered Säffle.
Yeah, not Säffle, but Ångermanland, for instance.
But on the point, I mean, going by train has somehow become a trend. My 5-year-old son is very angry at me for not having taken him on a night train. And when it had his birthday, he wanted to have a night train theme, which is quite hard when you have 5-year-old kids lie down and pretend to sleep. So it's obviously become a trend even down to 5-year-olds. But will this trend stay, do you think? Or is it just a bleep? Is it even possible to answer?
So, yeah, as an historian, I do a lot of forecasting, but it's impossible to say. But since we need to reach the Paris Agreement, flying also needs to be the increase needs to stop. Otherwise, in 2050, flying is going to be 20 or 25% of the emissions. So it cannot go on. So an important insight, of course, is to try and work with people who have decreased, and to make flying one of the transport sectors that we need to work with. But we cannot say. But these are people that we can learn from.
What do you think it would take for it? Like, what are the drivers that would make this group of people that you have here now, like, to become larger, and also like how to move that thinking also into the business community, because now it's also a lot of talk about like people making their vacation choices, but what about business? What about like people flying for work, which is in Europe massive? We
only studied people who had the private flying, basically. Yeah. So there are people in this group that might have reduced drastically, but still fly a bit in their business, even though they're not very many. So I think we need to reiterate that we need to know more about the people who didn't stop. What can make them make the shift? But I think we need to go back to the primary conclusion that knowing the proportions of this impact in relation to the things that we need to achieve in a very short time is a good way. And there are many pedagogical efforts that we can, or processes that we can embark on to try and convince people. We've mentioned apps and calculators, but there are also other ways of comparing, right? So this flight has so much sea ice, or this flight has so many dinosaurs, or so how do we translate CO2? This is a good task, I think, to start thinking about how do we make these things that are intangible for people really tangible, and to also translate this issue that is so much about now to be about also our children, right? So that intergenerational perspective seems to be a very good argument for many. As long as when you start looking at this as an issue and you realize that your children are going to be the ones that cannot fly, then you turn it on your head. But we need to know more about those who didn't stop in order to be able to say anything more substantial.
I believe that there is also knowledge from other processes of social change in history, and research on that for a movement to sustain or even to grow. It seems that it's important to talk about it, to respond to it from business and or employers, for instance, if their employees doesn't want to fly or prefer going by train, it should be made easy and it should be encouraged. And if it's encouraged by the employer, that tells the people that are trying to live their conscience that they can expand that way of being. And the same with policy, the policy dimensions. If policymakers are listening to the movements and trying to respond, it gives a signal that this movement can expand or go on. So I think it's very important with the dialogue between those different levels. But that's not something that I can extract from this study, but from reading a lot of research on social movements and change.
Should we see if there's any questions in the audience? There's 2 over here, 3, 4. Let's do 3 to start with. So if we start, Lina. Yeah.
Sorry. Who was it? Here, sorry.
Oh.
In your larger study on non-action, how common was carbon offsetting as a justification for flying?
We can't give quantitative replies because we haven't done quantitative studies, but people mention it, and it's also we have to tell you that the study with the broader issue on non-action isn't finished yet. We have a lot of surveys. We have started analyzing it, but we haven't published on it, and so on. But we can say that it's commonly mentioned. Yeah.
Next one. Yep.
My name is Sven Soden. I work for Nordic Energy Research, and I work with aviation. And I'm a guilty flyer. I fly a lot. I wondered about, and I'm Norwegian, so we're not experienced the same discussion on shame in Norway, but we do see a drop in aviation. So it would be interesting to see if that phenomenon is spreading across the countries. My question goes to whether some of those who decided to continue flying were actively interested in alternative fuels or electric aviation, things like that, basically wanting to continue to fly but do it in a more sustainably manner.
So I'm sorry, we cannot say anything about those who continue to fly. We can only say some things about those who stopped flying. And in the other survey, the argument that technology will solve this issue, whatever issue it is present, but not to the degree that we can see in the public discourse. So in the larger survey, people sometimes say technology is going to fix this. But it's not as prevalent as our politicians saying technology is going to fix this. But this also has to do, I think, we need to remember that we are studying people who want to change, but fail or succeed. We're not studying a cross-cut of Swedish population. We're looking at people who have knowledge and want to act in a sustainable way. So that's why this is not a cross-cut. But we believe it's really important to look at these people. There's been a lot of studies of people who don't manage and don't want to manage and just refer things to others to solve and continue their lives. We think it's really important to look at these people who want to do the right thing but are stopped by different hindrances on the way.
And that's also important in regard of the statistics. There is very much research on climate skeptics in the world. But in Sweden, there are only about 2% climate skeptics. The rest of us are either not very engaged, but still accepting that there is a climate change going on. But many of us are worried, actually, and want to live a sustainable life, and actually see ourselves as climate engaged. And that's the people that we are interested in our research.
We had some more questions. One here. Oh.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. So my name is Alexandra. I also work with climate issues, so this is a question that I battle pretty much every day. And my question is rather, how much responsibility should we feel for other people's emotions? I feel like it's a little bit too much to ask sometimes that we solve the climate crisis and also cater to other people's own emotional fragility at the same time, because we're spending a lot of energy on climate change deniers still after like 10 years. They're derailing the conversation and not pushing it forward. So how much should we push the agenda forward, and how much should we take care of people feeling sad about it?
Before you answer, let's do another question, because we have a lot of questions. här vid micken, eller vid stavet.
Yes, my name is Lars-Göran Mattsson from KTH. How could the insights you have gained from this study be used to convince those that are flying? How can you use these, convince those that are flying to stop flying? What kind of policy actions do you want to see, or other ways of changing their behavior?
So should we do?
Could I answer the first question? Yeah.
Okay.
How much we should cater to others' emotions. I would like to answer that not as a researcher of this project, but as a rhetorician. I would say that probably it's wasted energy to try to persuade a climate skeptic. But there are a lot of people who are not climate skeptic, but still are doubting or are hesitant to change their behavior. And there is an idea that we shouldn't, of course, shame people or make them uneasy in conversation. In that case, we might not even be invited to the next dinner, you know. But and maybe we shouldn't be so scared about it. I'm still invited to dinners. That's hopeful. But if we really want to reach somebody, we always have to take in their values, their situation, their emotions in some way or another. So to acknowledge the stress or the anxiety or the problems with this, I believe is important. So when talking to somebody who is in this cognitive dissonance mode, I think the most important thing is to listen to their cognitive dissonance and give place to that. And I used to tell them about my cognitive dissonance and how hard it was to decide not to fly, and how much I mourned it in relation to it. So and that sometimes makes us connect, but that's not our project here in this. We're researchers in this context, of course, but as a private person discussing this. And I would suggest, instead of listening to us, just the last week, a little book was translated to English. It's written by Maja Rosén, who have been an important person and maybe even started this flight-free movement, Stay on the Ground 2020 and so on. And she has written a little book. In Sweden it's called Flygpratarguiden. And in English, it's another title. You'll find it on the internet. And it's fantastic because it's harmonizing very well with our study. But she has written about her own experience from discussing those things with persons all around the country for several years. So that's a good start if you want to look closer at the more at conversation or advices on conversations on issues like this.
Very quick then.
Yeah.
Marking, I think, is very good, Lars-Göran, to mark transport. And the other one is
so information labeling.
Yeah, the information labeling. And the alternatives. That's the easiest policy thing, to make the alternatives work.
Policy. I think we have one more minute left. So Maria and Nina will be here for 15 minutes afterwards, so you can come up and ask them questions then. So instead we will do some concluding remarks. So some thoughts from all of you about what you want the audience to remember from this seminar tonight when they're sitting at the kitchen table. What is the main takeaway? Do you want to start, Hannah?
Oh, okay. I may be kind of continuing on the question about the feelings. I really would want people to kind of embrace a more complex idea of like the role of feelings in the climate decision making. It's like it's not negative feelings are not always bad. that it kind of depends on what you do with them, how you work with them, and that climate communication generally is received very in lots of different ways, because we are all different. We all respond to kind of different motivations and different feelings, and therefore, like, let's not pretend that we have a magical formula for communicating about climate. We are going to have multiple different formulas and use those wisely. So kind of the people who are not in this study, who are not who are not acting yet, that's still a massive like big question mark. Like how do those people process their feelings and the information that they're getting?
Yeah, I would like to lift up the hopefulness in this study. In the public discourse, one can get the impression that the human being is very egoistic and irrational and so on. I find these people in this study very wise, and they're taking responsibility. They're really engaged. It's kind of interesting role models, and I hope that the knowledge about them might help others to dare to live their to walk the talk and so on. So that's what I want to lift up.
Being an academic, I need to stress knowledge, obviously, but I would also bring to the kitchen table a discussion of justice that I think is important to have.
Thank you, Maria, Nina, and Hanna, and thank you to the audience. Tack! Här står Swish-numret också om ni vill swisha, som finns där borta. Om ni tar en bok så får ni gärna swisha en 20 eller så.